I live on Dharawal country, south of Sydney in Wollongong, the Illawarra, and lived for a long time on Ngaragu country in the Snowies, and that's kind of where my heart's country is. And I've had the absolute privilege over the years of spending time with a few people who are deep knowledge holders from these areas, and who have been so generous with parts of that knowledge that have opened my eyes. So the way I understand things is that when you have been in a place for this long, for tens of thousands of years, and you have a culture that has survived for that time, you have so much trial and error and so many learned lessons through that period of time, that what you've got is such a refined understanding of the way a place works. And if it seems to me as a white guy ring into this place that something appears not sophisticated on the surface of things, it's my problem. It's me not understanding something, because this is a thing that works. And so therefore, when I do my fire science, I'm using Western science to look at these things, my understanding is that I mark my work against this ancient knowledge. That as this knowledge, as I begin to understand something from this, that's when I check my work against it and see, am I on the right track? Because I think these two things will converge. If I am doing good science, I will approach these deep time learnings. So I talk about cooperation with country rather than management. Management is very much a Western colonial mindset. It's the idea that we are something different, something above the other species, that we, no one told us, but we have nominated ourselves as the species that's in charge. And, when I stand back and I look at us, we are essentially, and I'm sorry, this might be a bit rough for some people, but we're an introduced species of ape. That's me. And I got into the control room somehow, and there's all the switches there, and it's tempting to just flick switches and feel like, we're in charge and we can do all of this stuff. But we need to understand that there is complexity here that we have got to learn to fit in with. And this is how ancient cultures have worked, is that they have watched and learnt how to fit with the other species, and took a relationship, instead of management, took a relationship of kinship, of fitting with other species, of not trying to dominate, but of trying to work with what is there. So my question, we've looked a lot at the impacts of fire, of burning, of strategic fuel breaks, of all of these different sorts of things. We've looked at their impacts on wildlife, on forests. My question is, do they actually even work? Do they do what it says on the tin? So what makes a forest more or less flammable? The industry thinking on it is this idea that you just take out the stuff that burns, and it seems nice and simple. And what that involves, because you've got to take it out, it's something that they refer to as active management, active land management. And this is a fairly recent term. We don't just say management now, we say active management, and somehow or other that's management plus, and what it means is it's a cover-all term that becomes a blank check. People will say, climate change is serious, fires are getting worse and worse and worse, and all of that is true. And I say we can't do nothing. I actually heard the head of fire research that plans out a lot of the locations for these prescribed burns from Melbourne University say it is better to do the wrong thing than to do nothing at all. Quick, flick some switches, That's panic thinking. This idea that we just, so long as we are active, then it makes us feel better that we've done something. But we may be the cause of the problem, not the cure. So where do we get this idea about fuel load? What actually is fuel? Well, basically fuel is just anything that's burning. So if you've got plants that are burning their fuel, if they're not burning, we'll get to that. They're involved in the fire. If they're not burning, they're still doing something. The idea of fuel load, though, is this idea that you can quantify fuel just by the weight of it, that's all that matters. So you just talk about tonnes per hectare of fuel. And that idea actually came from US pine forestry in the 1950s. The term fuel load was invented by a forester called George Byram, who was looking at how to burn pine forests to stop succession happening so you wouldn't lose your timber crop. And the irony of that is that if succession happened in those pine forests, you got other more mesic species, wetter species, oaks and hickories and things like that, that actually made a cool, damp environment that they couldn't burn. It actually stopped fires there. So they were burning to keep it flammable because the species they wanted was the early successional species, which was longleaf pine. That's the timber crop. And so they came up with this science of how to burn safely under your timber crop without destroying your timber. And the only thing you're burning is the layer of of pine needles on the ground, which they could measure by weight, and that was fuel load. We introduced that to Australia, or another forester, in this case Alan MacArthur, introduced that to Australia. And he said, yeah, that's, pine forests, Australian bush, much the same. And he put out this leaflet here, and it's a forestry leaflet. Now, when I talk about peer review, this is not a peer-reviewed paper. Peer review is important because all it is error checking. It means that when I do a study, anything that I say here, I try to ensure that it is something that has been through peer review. It means where there's a random group of people, and I don't necessarily know who they are. They're people who may or may not like me personally. They may have entirely different views, but they have some knowledge in this field, and they check my work, check my maths, and they bring up their objections, and we might debate a bit back and forth. But the idea is that it has to run the gauntlet before I say it. This never did that. He just gave us 9 dots drawn in this leaflet, fitted a line to it, and said that what it means is that if you double the amount of fuel, the weight of fuel on the ground, you double the rate of spread of a fire. You are not allowed on a fire ground unless you can recite that scripture. Double the fuel load, double the rate of spread. And the reason that's so important is because nearly all of the fine fuel load is in the layer of dead leaves on the ground. That's about 3/4 of the weight of fine fuels. And what that does, another paper from around the same time, is that and this one was peer reviewed, but the leaves, you straight after fire, you've got bare ground, you've got leaves falling from plants, they accumulate fairly quickly, but after a while, once you get a bit of a depth, you start getting a moist layer underneath the leaf litter, and it starts to decay from the bottom. There's fungi and macroinvertebrates and things come in there, and after a while, you eventually get to a point where there's equilibrium. It's being added to at the same rate that it's being decayed from the bottom. And if that didn't happen, then leaf layers would be up to your head in the oldest forests. But so what that means is that if you double the fuel load and you double the rate of spread, and that increases over time, that fuel load, it means that always, without exception, old forests are dangerous and young forests are not. The more often you burn, the less risk there is of fire, less intense fires and slower spreading fires. That is the basis of our management, and it's because of those 9 dots on the graph. So has there been peer review? Well, yes, there has. In the 1990s, Neil Burrows in WA very, very carefully replicated those experiments with the same type of leaf litter and everything, and both in the lab and in the field, and he found there was no relationship at all. It didn't matter what the fuel load was, it didn't affect the rate of spread of the fire. There's no relationship. But you might say, well, that's just in the lab. Well, much more recently, Michael Story and his colleagues looked at this with comparing bushfires, where they were mapping edges of bushfires with infrared scans, and they compared it this time and then an hour later, so they got exactly how fast it was spreading. And these were fires of all different ranges of intensity and under all sorts of different weather conditions. And what they found, again, was there was no relationship with fuel load. Now, he says here, almost no linear relationship. Now, if you are anyone familiar with statistics, that number at the bottom, R squared equals 0.001. Generally speaking, you say you can pretty much ignore it if you get an R squared less than 0.2. That's less than 0.2. You can ignore that. There is no relationship there. Also in GECO's own publications, this is an old one, the Overall Fuel Hazard Assessment Guide from 2010. They've shown here, just with a really simple experiment, that if you crumple up a bit of newspaper, you get a bigger flame than if it's lying flat, because it's not about the weight of the fuel, it's about the structure. They're aware of that. Project Vesta is the biggest set of experimental burns that have been done in Australia. It's a multi-million-dollar program that happened over a decade or so. They still continue to reanalyse the work, and the latest publication in 2022 laid it out very, very simply. It's the height and the cover of the understory. So everything we just saw in the last presentation about all of that dense regrowth, that's the stuff that they say makes a fire uncontrollable. That's the state-of-the-art empirical fire behaviour model that all of the agencies pay lip service to. And they say, this is the best fire model there is. It tells us it's all about how high and dense the understory is. Nothing to do with the weight of leaf litter. My own work with a group of other researchers across universities, I took a totally different tack, because I started working in fire management and in remote area firefighting, and I could just see so starkly that what we were doing, A, wasn't working, and it was giving us extremely bad advice. It was telling us that this fire here was safe to get into, and you could send fire crews in there because the fuel load was really low. And this place over here, you'd have to stay away from because it had a really high fuel load. And so often it was exactly the wrong way around. And so you'd miss an opportunity to put that fire out and contain it, and you'd put your fire crews at risk, putting them in front of that fire. And so what I did was, I started from a theoretical perspective. I just wanted to know what makes one plant burn differently to another. And so I spent a long time just burning a lot of different leaves from different plant species to see what made different leaves burn differently. And yeah, sort of got into my own little world there, and tied all of that together mathematically. And it's all this question of, on a second-by-second basis, of how does fire spread from that one burning leaf to the next, and so on up through plant to plant. And so I use this mechanistic model. So you can use it anywhere, instead of like the other approach where you've just done a whole lot of experimental fires in the Jarrah forest. It means that your predictions there, really they're specific to Jarrah forest. Anytime you apply it in another forest, it's saying, it's assuming you're burning in Jarrah. Whereas something like this, you can apply it anywhere. So, don't know what's happened here, but yep. So I've got full fuel load on the left, half the fuel load in paper on the right, so 5 sheets of paper. You can see you're getting a much bigger flame with a much smaller fuel load. And the videos are crushed up, but the reason for it is pretty simple. You've got heat spreading upwards, because heat rises, so it's one burning sheet ignites the one above it. Whereas if you've got sheets laid flat on the ground, like a layer of leaves on the ground, the air can't get into it. It can't spread through that well. And also the heat's rising up rather than crossways into that paper. So if you've got your fuels arrayed upright and aerated like that, fire spreads up through them really fast. And there's this little equation that Byram came up with in the 1950s, where he multiplies basically fuel load times rate of spread. But it's only rate of spread in a crossways direction, because he's only interested in a flat layer of pine needles. Whereas in Australia, we have plants that go upwards, and an upward array of leaves where one leaf can light the leaf above it. That's a crown fire. So a crown fire is when the tree crowns burn. It's entirely uncontrollable. There is nothing you can do about it. It puts up such a pulse of heat that if you've got an unstable atmosphere, that's when you get a firestorm. That's the black skies at 2 in the afternoon, and all sorts of freaky stuff can happen out of that. It can send burning bits of bark 20 kilometres ahead of the fire. It can be a storm that starts new fires with its own lightning. This is something that happens only if you have got a structure that can get fire from the ground up to the treetops. So this is my main field that I'm working on, which is my combination of trying to tie together analyses of what has happened in the past together with that theoretical modelling that I was describing before. And this is Professor Bowman's summary of my work, the pipe dream that forests can magically, ecologically self-organise to become bushfire-proof. It's a beautiful thought, but that's not real. He's no longer a fan of my work, reading between the lines, but we had worked together in the past. Now, I was down in his neck of the woods a few years ago looking at an area in the Huon Valley, and the top picture there is regrowth from some logging, and the bottom picture is the original forest just about 100 metres away that hasn't been logged, and due to a group of ratbag protesters that stopped them from doing it. And so what I didn't know was that Bowman's lab were out studying the same forests in that area, and they were looking at how the 2019-20 fires had burnt through those forests. And they looked at how did the severity of fire differ? So severity specifically means it's generally taken as a measure from a satellite. It looks at how much vegetation was either burnt or scorched. So a more severe fire means more was burnt or scorched, and it roughly can correlate with the size of the flames you're getting out of it. So what they found was that the severity was much less in the old forest on the bottom, and also that 98% of the fire edge stopped in that bottom forest, in the old growth forest. Now, I don't know how or why those small plants became big ones, but that particular magic that we're examining is what I call ecological control theory. How does plant growth make a forest less flammable? And it's actually not rocket surgery. So you've got a lot of plants in the understory. There's a lot of things to burn. You know, that's the Project Vesta work. It says a tall, dense understory means you've got big, hard-to-control flames. That all makes perfect sense. You can't get big flames from a layer of dead leaves on the ground for the same reason as you saw in that simple experiment with the paper. You know, I used to do this with fire crews. I'd throw out 20 tonnes per hectare of leaf litter on the ground in a car park and get them to use the official model to predict the flame height. But then I'd get them to tell me, what do you think the flame height's going to be? What's your gut feeling on it? And try and get them to deprogram, because they'd always get it right. They'd always say, oh, it's just going to be knee height. Whereas the model was saying, oh, 3 metre high flames, you know, it's 20 tonnes per hectare, that's really heavy. It was always knee height, because to get big flames, you need to burn big stuff. So burn shrubs, you'll get big flames from shrubs. But what you'll notice in the background is that here the trees aren't burning, and that's usually the case. In the black summer, 88% of the time the trees weren't burning. 12% of the time you had crown fire. And those crown fire runs are the bits that everybody remembers, but most of the area was not crown fire. Most of the time, the trees aren't burning. So fuel is the plants that's burning. The trees aren't fuel because they're not burning. But they're affecting the fire because the wind speed below the trees is less than the wind speed above. That's why you plant a windbreak in the paddock, because the trees slow the wind down underneath themselves, and the wind is what makes a fire spread. It's what makes a fire severe. So you can have a really hot day, but if you've got no wind, it's not necessarily going to be a bad fire. It may be, depending on other factors, but it's when you get a strong wind, they're the days that freak firefighters out. If you've got trees up there, then the wind down at the fire level is much less. That's why when you get those crown fire runs, they spread something like 10 times faster than the fires just burning underneath the trees. Now, if we allow those understory plants to magically self-organise, also known as growing, they get taller and they outcompete the plants underneath them because they're bigger. They're taking the light. Each patch on the ground has a budget of light, of water in the soil, and of nutrients in the soil. You can only support so much biomass from that. So if you have a big plant taking that biomass, there's nothing left over for the small plants. You try it in your garden. You've got a great big tree growing. Try and plant your roses under it. You know, you can't do it. Those bigger plants take the resources. And what happens is that typically you get this thinning on the ground layer. The more vegetation you've got up there, the less you've got down there. Now, in a wet forest, you can also get succession happening, which is where you get other species coming in that can cope with those shady conditions. And some of them are quite specialist things that can also cope with a soil that's not actually very wet. You know, Dicksonia tree ferns, they're basically just a mass of roots. And so they're getting a whole lot of feed coming in, and the leaves that are catching in the tops of them, and the water soaks down from the top of the plant. Even you look at a Regnan's tree or any other tree with smooth bark on it, you notice certain times of year that bark has a greenish tinge. That's chlorophyll. It's photosynthesizing through the bark. And what it's doing is it's actually using up the waste CO2, because what happens is when it photosynthesizes through the leaf, it brings that energy stored down into the plant, and then it burns it in the cambium of the trunk. And there's a little bit left over each time, and then it lets that CO2 out. Now, when you're letting CO2 in the leaf, you've got to open a stomata, just a tiny little hole in the leaf, and you lose a little bit of water each time. But when you've got CO2 already inside and you're letting it out through the bark, you've got all of that fuel stored right there, so you don't lose any water. So you'll often notice a really old mountain ash has got barely any leaves up the top, and it's just got this huge white trunk. That's doing the photosynthesizing, and it's really water efficient. We've got water efficient plants in the wettest forests. And what it means is that you can have even more species growing underneath it, and more and more layers, which makes it so dark down at ground level.
Oh, sorry. If there's water in the trunk, does that mean it's less likely to burn?
Well, it's usually not the trunk that burns. It's generally just the leaves that burn.
Wouldn't that help protect the trunk too?
It will help protect the trunk, but mountain ash will... yeah, I mean, they will die from scorch, just from the heat of burning plants around them. So it's, yeah. Anyway, so...
Thank you.
No worries. So, yeah, so that's kind of really simplistic version of how it works. But the point is, when those plants get taller and outcompete the things underneath them, you get a smaller flame underneath, but also because they're now tall enough that they're not able to ignite, they're now slowing the wind. They're no longer fuel. That understory used to be fuel. The saplings that were there have now turned into mid-story, and they're no longer fuel. Now they're slowing the fire down. And the really short-lived shrubs that are often germinated straight after a fire, they've done their time now, and they're just scattered out through the understory. So this is the natural sort of succession that you often get across the area. This is, you can probably get a copy of these slides if you're interested in looking into the papers. This is stuff I've published on it and on the modelling, as well as the studies of mapped fire histories there. Now, I am not new in noticing this. So back in the 80s, Ray Specht is a legendary Australian ecologist, and laid it out nice and simply. If you disturb a forest, if you cut a tree down, if you scorch it with flames or burn it, or there's wind throw, then you take out overstory plants, and that's going to be compensated for with new plants. You've freed up the budget, new plants move in, and they grow from the ground. So you had things there slowing the fire down, and now you've got stuff here speeding it up. But he wasn't the first either. Back in 1939, Charles Lane Poole was the Inspector General of Australian Forests. He was a forester, kind of like top forester in the country. And he said the reason our bush is flammable is because we've been burning it. And the way to make it less flammable is to stop burning it. He said that in the Royal Commission, and that was one of the findings of the 1939 Royal Commission after the Black Friday fires, which were up until this century, the worst things that had happened here, worst fires that had happened. But so Stretton said, yes, burning the bush is the reason why these fires burnt so severely. But he said one other thing on top, which was that he said, we've burnt so much of it now, I don't think we can back out. In my mind, he admitted defeat. He said we've got no choice but to keep burning these patches around the edge. We've locked ourselves into what he described as a cycle of destruction which cannot be escaped in our day. 1939. It's not 1939 anymore. Yeah, we've got climate change, but we've also got a few other things that have changed since then, and I will talk about those soon. Roger's family up at Walgolmerang, a grazing family, they documented nearly a century of them burning their forests, and their conclusion was, yeah, we kind of stuffed that up. You can't get through there anymore. It's so dense. We made it dense by burning it. It doesn't make it open, it makes it dense. And then Uni Melbourne, Sarah McCall-Gorston led this study of records kept by fire crews across South Australia and Victoria, and showed that across the whole area, the older forests have less shrub cover in them. And she's using a really rough measure that's just like a quick eyeball measure, so it's not a really strong finding, but it's still the overall trend. So we know this happens. This is not my own freaky ideas. People have seen this forever, and I'm not coming up with something new. You've seen it, and I'm giving you permission to believe your eyes. So how does that work out in practice? Well, you've got a forest there where you can see in the tiny little inset there's a lot of green at the top. That means most of the plants are slowing the fire down because they're tall. Flammability, that red line, is quite low. If you burn it, you can make it even lower by just creating bare ground. That's why prescribed burning is done. You slightly reduce that fire risk, the flammability of that forest. You've still got plants up there, you've scorched some of them away, but you've got nothing at all on the ground. So for a little while, you've got quite low flammability. But this is not a layer of dead leaves. This is a forest composed of lives wanting to survive, and they fight back. And so straight after they've been hit like that, you get this massive flush of dense growth, as we saw in the last presentation. Life trying to come back and compete. And what that is doing is, as that shrub layer gets taller and denser, that flammability keeps going up and up and up until you get to this sort of peak where even the shrub layer can ignite the trees. And that's when you can get the crown fires, when you've got that disturbed forest. So the stuff we saw in the last presentation where you've got a dense understory, that's the age when you can get crown fires in that forest. They made that. They made it do that. Because what happens after that is eventually that mid-story gets tall enough that it turns into plants slowing the fire down instead of feeding it, and the ephemeral shrubs die out and you get the open understory and you go back to what it was. So that's the general trend. That's the mapped trend. That's history. That's what I measured across over 1 million hectares, every single bushfire that had happened across multiple different forest communities. I broke every bushfire up into 1 hectare cells. You know, you'll often hear somebody say, oh, look, I've seen a bushfire stop at this prescribed burn here. I'm sure they did. That's 1 point on the graph. I measured 65 million points. Put them all into that, and I looked at the trend for all of these different forests, and every one of them had the same trend. Low fire risk straight after fire, increases really quickly, then it drops off. The timing's different, the intensity of that curve is different, but it's always that same trend. That's the likelihood that fire will happen, and when it does happen, it'll be a crown fire. So that is what has happened. None of that is theoretical. Everything I've described up until now is theoretical, telling you how it works. This is what happens. So, not just me, David Lindenmeyer, Chris Taylor and others looked at the 2019-20 burn patterns in Victoria and again found the likelihood of crown fire did exactly that. Big spike in recovering forests and then it drops down as those forests get older. Around Sydney, Illawarra, Blue Mountains, again, crown fire only tends to happen in younger forests. In fact, another group of researchers in the same area said that by the time you get to 30 years after fire, there's almost no chance of crown fire happening. They almost don't happen. That is a huge part of Australia's population just living in that small area. So if you're concerned about protecting life and property, you don't want country that's been burnt within the last 30 years. So don't do it. And then again, another Chris Taylor leading this work after the 2009 fires, again showing the likelihood of crown fire during the worst, most severe fire that we've recorded in this country. There were still places where the stand age was old and the likelihood and frequency of crown fire was really low. Despite all those weather conditions. That fire raced up on the worst run, raced up Mount Disappointment, got to the top to ash trees that had been born in 1730. And it dropped out of the crowns and it spread slow underneath them. That is very well documented history. So you might ask, why are we still thinking this way if we've got such strong evidence? You know, why do we still think that fire risk just increases and stays high? Well, there's a simple reason for that. You know, I can show this stuff and people have been saying this stuff for a long time, but what tends to happen is there is a mountain of papers saying prescribed burns work, they're effective. And the way they do that is they focus on this part of the story, which I call the smoke and mirrors window. So you look at the left of that red line straight after fire, the prescribed burn that you did last year. I saw that stop a bushfire. That looked really effective. That's fantastic. It was bare ground. Yes, you did. Great. And then you look at the other stuff where there hasn't been a burn for a little while and you say, you know, fire was uncontrollable through there. But that's just what they're calling long unburnt country. Is in most cases something that's been burnt within the last 10 years. Sometimes it'll go a little bit longer than that. And the timing of these things differs with forests as well. But, you know, that's what you do. You just focus on that little smoke and mirrors window, and then you've got the story that the longer you go without fire, the more flammable the forest is. And if you say that, the assumption is that it just stays flammable, just like that curve up in the top right graph. So let's look at a worked example of how that plays out. This is the Jarrah Forest in the Project Vesta experiments, southwest WA. They looked at plots with different times since fire, and they said the longer the time since fire, the faster fire spread on average, which is quite valid for what they looked at. The oldest plot they looked at was 22 years old, which very coincidentally happens to be the exact age that their own colleague just a couple of years before said the understory starts to thin. So they specifically put in the smoke and mirrors window there and said, we'll only look at the increasing trend, and didn't look at the decrease. And that way they were able to say it increases and does not decrease. So I came in more recently with David Lindenmeyer and Don Bradshaw in WA, and we looked at their mapped histories, and we did the same thing that we'd done in the east here. And what we found was this kind of rough trend where it increases and then it drops off again later on, but it's not really tight to the shrub curve. But still, the agency responsible for doing the burning wasn't that happy with it, because if it drops off at the end, then that means that they're not curing the problem, they're causing it. Government agencies don't like that said about their policies. So they responded by saying, look, you've analysed our data, but what you need to understand is that our data is crap. And so they said, but not all of it, not all of it. The only bits that are crap are to the right of that line, which happens to coincide exactly with the peak. So they said, get rid of all of the data to the right of exactly that line, and then you can redo your analysis. So we said, well, okay, there's your list of all of the things that's wrong with your data. What if we actually just look at the data and pull out the bits that fit that, that are bad according to your specifications? Instead of chucking the whole apple out, we'll just cut the spot out. We did that. It turned out it was 1.6% of the data that was bad. The other 98.4%, which they wanted to throw out just in case, turned out to be totally fine. And when we pulled out the 1.6%, actually our curve suddenly now fit exactly what we had expected, which that's called an own goal. So, so I look at, I've gone over the time. I'm still thinking in terms of, anyway. Tell me to shut up if I'm going on for too long, but I will tell you two things quickly. Firstly, this was the parliamentary inquiry that was conducted very recently into last summer's bushfires in Victoria. And they stated that in places like the Otways, they said that planned burns help to reduce the intensity of bushfires. And you know that this information investigating the effectiveness of a government policy is true because it came from the government that made the policy. And they have marked their homework and they've told us it was right. They also looked at the effectiveness of planned burns down on the Walwa fire, sort of near the Murray River. Now, I actually was looking at that at the time and watching what was going on there. So when you look at it, that black blob, that was the fire area fairly early on in the fire, and the red blobs of different shades are prescribed burns that have happened nearly all in the last 10 years. And the darker the red they are, the more recent they are. Now, they'd said, there was a 2025 prescribed burn that was critical in containing that fire. And when I look at what I measured, well, first question, why, if you had all of those prescribed burns in the last 10 years, did you get a fire tornado? Like, that's unnecessarily over the top. A crown fire is bad enough, but why throw in a tornado? That's the heat, the power of that crown fire mixing with an unstable atmosphere. How did you get that if all of that country had so many prescribed burns in the last 10 years? That's burning directly out of the image that I just showed you before. So I looked at this compared to what I had measured from, the 65 million data points of history, and compared it for the forest types here. And what I found was that, yes, if you look at the prescribed burn done in 2025, you would expect a low likelihood of crown fire. It's probably going to be helpful. But all the rest of those burns made the country sit there. And you've got the smoke and mirrors window coming in because they treated them as if they were unburnt country. They said, you know, the prescribed burns helped because if we're only looking at 2025, that's the prescribed burns they were interested in. But the background was not unburnt country. The background was their old prescribed burns. And if they had never done those prescribed burns, that's the age of the forest. That's the likelihood of crown fire. It would have been the same as if the entire block had been burnt in 2025. And you get it for free. You don't have to burn the whole block every single year. That's the two choices. Either burn it every year or don't burn it at all. That's how you get that low level of crown fire risk. So when they talk about prescribed burns, well, they're only effective for a few years. They only have an effect for this amount of time. That's not true. They still have an effect after that amount of time. It's just that that's the effect that they have. So I'm going to just skip through to the end. There's too much I would like to talk about. So coming back to Dharawal country. Up on the plateau, there's a few different parts of Dharawal country with different stories and different backgrounds. But up on the plateau, they talk about a specific lyrebird called Wirrachirrabin, and she was well loved by all the others in the area because the reason she's got black and brown feathers is because she saved everybody from a fire. She took the oldest and the youngest people down and showed them where they could shelter from a fire, but there was no shelter for her. So she got burnt, and that was her sacrifice. And also she's the wise woman who speaks everybody's language, and she resolves the conflicts. So in Wirrachirrabin's country, which is called Yandelara, it means peace country. In Yandelara, there were two people that lived there, two lovers, Murugan and Urawong. And they were so in love, they tended to just hang out together, just the two of them alone. But there was a young guy called Berry who wanted Urawong, and he hid down by the creek, waited for Murugan to come down to the creek for water, speared him in the back. Then he hit Urawong over the head and carried her off on his shoulder. Now, Murugan didn't die. After a while, he got up and he saw the tracks going off. And he followed the tracks for a couple of days. Now, during that time, Berry was gradually getting more and more tired from carrying Urawong, and she was pretending to be unconscious the whole time so that he'd have to carry her. And eventually, he tired out, and then she escaped from him and went back to Yandelara and left no tracks on the way going back. And Murugan caught up after she'd escaped. And he worked out what had happened, and he thought, I can just go back to Yandelara and be reunited and everything will be great. Or I can get my revenge on Berry. And he chose going for revenge on Berry and chased after him. I should say, this story comes from a lady called Auntie Fran Bodkin. Auntie Fran is an absolute legend. She was taken from her parents 13 times and 13 times escaped and found her way back home. She's 90 years old now. So she fought pretty hard for this sort of knowledge. So Murugan chased after Berry, but he was also still weak from his injuries. And he fought Berry, but he wasn't able to beat him because he was weak. So eventually he gave up and he started heading back to Yandelara. Now, meanwhile, Urawong had gotten back and she couldn't find Murugan anywhere. She found a patch of his blood next to the creek where he'd been speared, but nobody had seen him since then. So she eventually came to the conclusion that the spirits had taken Murugan and gave up. and she lay down on the ground, covered herself with the flowers of Yandellera and died. Morrigan then came home and he found her there, and he realised what had happened, and that it was because he had gone for revenge and that he had caused her death. And he was so heartbroken that he lay down next to her and died next to her. Yes, this is the original Romeo and Juliet. Yes. Yep. Auntie Fran, she's held in for a long time. So the spirits saw Morrigan and Urrawong, and they were also just so broken by how sad this story was that they turned them into the two trees, two species of Cryptocoria, two rainforest species that grow through the area, and you can see them growing through the mid-story here. They are almost the only trees in that mid-story. There's a few others mixed in there, but they create a mid-story that's got about 90% cover. And underneath it, it's so dark and shaded that the ground is just bare leaf litter with scattered little maidenhair ferns and things through it. And on a really hot day, you can get in there and it's cool. But you'll see this patch here where there's just a hole in the canopy and a whole lot of shrubs growing. I was walking up in that area in 2020, January 2020, peak of the black summer. Our skies were just dark with smoke every day, with from distant fires coming into us, and we were just waiting for the day when Wollongong would be hit by one of these. What we didn't know was that an arsonist had lit a fire just up behind my place on this mountain. And when I went out and looked at it, I checked it out. I went down and I spoke to the fire brigade, spoke to different fire agencies. Nobody knew anything about it. Nobody had gone to put it out. Nobody was aware of it because it had gone out by itself. And I've been following this, tracking this fire ever since then. And all around the edge, on the left there, the uphill side of it, it stopped at a wombat track. But then on the flanks and the downhill side where you can see the shrubs are thinner, it petered out by itself. It stopped by itself. And the reason it stopped is because Morrigan and Urrawong keep this open peace country underneath themselves that is cool and is moist and has got nothing for a bushfire to race through underneath it. Morrigan and Urrawong saved us from a bushfire in 2020 and nobody knew. Now, interesting thing about that story is there is no mention of fire anywhere in that story. So how am I making this a fire story? Well, Morrigan and Urrawong, if you look out over the burnt patch when you next go out over there, you'll see a whole lot of dead stems. They're killed by the mildest fire. That dense cover of Morrigan and Urrawong is if you don't burn them. Like those flames would have been the size of my foot. Tiny little flames that petered out, and yet they still killed those trees because they've got thin bark that just doesn't cope with fire. So I suppose what I take from that is that these stories contain such an immense wealth of knowledge that we miss so easily. We think, well, that's a proto-Romeo and Juliet type story, and it's a fun, interesting story. But it's also a story about what healthy peace country looks like here on this part of Dharawal country. And that's what we need to understand when people are starting to say, oh, this is Aboriginal knowledge here, and somebody makes some nice simplistic statement. We've got people in the community who have got hard fought for knowledge. People who, I said Auntie Fran escaped 13 times. Her dad was a white guy. He said, you look pretty white. They're going to take you. So they lived in Western Sydney at the time. He showed her his central station, showed her how to walk down the railway line and find home. So no matter where she got taken to, she got taken out to Burke, escaped from the cattle property out there, caught a train back in to Central and walked back down the line back home. And then she went, after her mum died, they had a little knitting group there amongst the other Dharawal ladies who were much older than her. And they'd sit in this closed up house knitting together, just quietly speaking Dharawal and learning languages, learning stories. And this is how it happened. I know a woman who wasn't taken because she was just too sick when she was a kid. Another woman who just very successfully hid in the ferns every time the cars came around. You know, there's stories of people who were taken, but still in the missions, they secretly spoke language to each other, secretly shared stories, and they often were punished so harshly for this stuff. So any bit of remaining knowledge, this is why I am so honoured to meet someone like Auntie Marg here, because anybody who is holding a little bit of knowledge, I'm aware that it has come at a cost. Somebody has paid the bill for that. And that knowledge is so priceless. So let's not let all of this stuff just be washed over by some sort of McDonald's version of Aboriginal knowledge that we're told. We need to recognise there is deep, beautiful knowledge that doesn't necessarily fit in with our KPIs. So thank you very much.